Canada is watching a moment that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Germany has now warned its citizens not to travel to the United States. Canadians are turning away from the southern border in numbers that can no longer be dismissed as seasonal fluctuations. And while Washington still projects the confidence of a global magnet, the economic fallout tells a very different story. America's tourism machine, once unstoppable, is leaking billions, and the world is quietly redirecting its attention north.
We have boycotted traveling to the States.
Travel to the United States continues to take a hit. In October, according to new data from StatsCan, the number of Canadians returning on trips from the U.S. was down more than 26% year over year. Political turmoil with the current U.S. administration erupted soon after Donald Trump returned to the White House, and he began poking fun at America's northern neighbor and attacking Canada's sovereignty.
Throughout late 2025 and into early 2026, Canadian return trips from the United States dropped sharply, down roughly a quarter compared to previous years. For a country where quick border crossings were part of normal life, this marked a significant rupture. At nearly the same time, Germany released an advisory urging its citizens to reconsider travel to the U.S., citing growing concerns about public safety and the unpredictability of law enforcement encounters. It was a diplomatic jolt, not because it was loud, but because it was rare for such an ally to issue such a warning. Canadian school boards soon followed the same logic, shifting thousands of student trips away from American cities and toward domestic destinations or Europe. What had long been a cultural reflex, go south for cheaper trips, suddenly no longer looked obvious. A slow recalibration began, and every sign now suggests it will not be temporary.
Tourism responds instantly to fear, instability, or political uncertainty. When that uncertainty becomes the defining feature of a destination, visitors react long before officials issue formal advice. The United States is now experiencing exactly that. While global travel has been expanding, American inbound numbers have been slipping, and the drop in Canadian travel has become a clear indicator that North America's usual balance is shifting. When your closest neighbor and your biggest market start pulling back, the signal is unmistakable. Under President Donald Trump's second term, border entry into the United States has taken on an atmosphere of volatility. Reports of unpredictable screenings and aggressive enforcement have created a perception that non-Americans cannot rely on a stable or respectful process at the airport or the land crossing. Germany's warning crystallized what many individuals already felt, that visiting America now carries risks that never used to enter the conversation. Canada, in contrast, presents a fundamentally different image. Its border regime is steady, predictable, and grounded in procedural clarity rather than political theatrics. That difference matters because when travelers feel uncertain, they do not argue, they simply choose another destination.
The financial consequences of this shift are already showing. Canadians typically spend more than $20 billion a year in the United States, supporting hotels, restaurants, retail, entertainment, and regional economies from Florida to New York to Nevada. A decline of roughly 25% represents a direct loss of $5 to $6 billion. And that is only the Canadian piece. Germany's caution, along with broader European hesitation, is adding its own pressure. Even a modest decline across Europe places several additional billions at risk. When combined with weakening demand from other international visitors, America's tourism industry could face losses in the range of $15 to $20 billion. For states built on visitor spending, that is a structural vulnerability, not a short-term inconvenience. Canada, meanwhile, stands to gain from this continental realignment. If even 1 in 10 Canadians who once traveled south instead spend their money domestically, Canada captures roughly $2 billion of redirected activity each year. Add a reasonable flow of European travelers who now prefer a safer, calmer alternative to the U.S., and Canada's tourism sector could see a further $1.5 to $2.5 billion in additional growth. In practical terms, Canada is becoming the beneficiary of America's instability.
Tourism is not only an economic indicator, it is a geopolitical barometer. When Europeans hesitate to visit America, it is a sign that perceptions of U.S. governance are changing. Trust, once the foundation of America's international appeal, is eroding. Canada enters this moment with a different narrative. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the country presents itself as a dependable democracy with a stable political climate, clean energy leadership, a strong rule of law tradition, and a global voice that does not oscillate with every election cycle. As the U.S. leans deeper into internal conflict, Canada emerges not as a loud replacement, but as a steady one. The decline in tourism is not random. It aligns with the political environment President Trump has cultivated, one where aggressive border tactics and hardline rhetoric shape public perception. Visitors do not parse constitutional arguments or policy memoranda. They respond to atmosphere, and right now, the American atmosphere feels uncertain. This is why Canada's position matters. Carney has consistently emphasized diversification, not just in trade and energy, but in cultural and economic relations. The tourism shift mirrors the same trend seen in supply chains. When the United States becomes unpredictable, the world begins looking for alternatives. Canada is filling that space naturally. If European governments continue issuing travel cautions, the United States could lose tens of billions in annual spending. The country would still attract visitors, but the automatic assumption that America is the default destination would no longer hold. Canada, conversely, is positioned to become North America's global gateway. Toronto could overtake several U.S. cities as the preferred Atlantic entry point. Vancouver could consolidate its rise as the Pacific hub for Asian and European travelers. And as Canada invests in clean power, cultural districts, protected landscapes, and international partnerships, its long-term tourism appeal will only grow stronger. This shift is not dramatic. It is steady, quiet, and persistent. And those kinds of shifts are the ones that last. Canada's appeal is rooted in its fundamentals: safety, political stability, modern and diverse cities, vast natural landscapes, and a border experience that treats visitors as guests rather than suspects. It also benefits from strong ties with Europe and Asia, allowing coordinated travel campaigns and direct flight networks that continue expanding. As the United States struggles with internal volatility, Canada's calmness becomes an economic asset. Germany's warning was more than a caution. It was a verdict on American instability. Canadians see it. Europeans see it. The spending patterns are already shifting. The United States is losing billions because the world no longer assumes it is safe. Canada, meanwhile, is becoming the natural alternative, not through slogans, but through competence, stability, and a seriousness the world increasingly values. So the question for viewers is simple. If America will not fix the instability driving travelers away, how long will it be before Canada becomes the true gateway to North America? World leaders have had enough, and the newest mega trade bloc, led by the EU and India, has left Donald Trump completely on the outside. As nations pull back from Washington's volatility, Canada suddenly stands out as the dependable partner the world actually wants to work with. In a moment when alliances are being rebuilt from scratch, Ottawa is becoming a stabilizing force, while Trump pushes the United States into deeper isolation. This isn't a symbolic snub. It's a realignment of global power, where reliability matters more than rhetoric, and where middle powers like Canada are being pulled to the front of the room, because great powers can no longer be trusted to hold it together. What's playing out now is not a diplomatic disagreement. It is a structural shift in who the world sees as credible. In January 2026, U.S. President Donald Trump opened another front in his trade battles by threatening 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Ottawa made a deal with China, a reference to the preliminary tariff arrangement on electric vehicles and agricultural products reached during Prime Minister Mark Carney's recent visit to Beijing. The escalation came on the heels of Carney's widely noted speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he argued that the post-Cold War order was not evolving, but rupturing, and that middle powers must deepen their cooperation to protect their interests in this new landscape. Tensions rose further when Trump publicly referred to Carney as the Governor of Canada, revoked an invitation for Ottawa to join his U.S.-led Board of Peace, and floated a new 50% tariff on Canadian aircraft imports linked to aviation certification disputes. Each move reinforced the message that Washington was prepared to pressure allies who stepped outside its preferred economic orbit. While Trump escalated his rhetoric, world leaders were charting a different path. On January 27, the European Union and India finalized a major free trade agreement, creating a bloc representing billions of consumers and reshaping global trade flows without U.S. involvement. Across the Pacific, countries from the UK to Japan and Canada itself have been engaging with China through carefully managed, pragmatic economic channels. That trend has only strengthened as Trump's unpredictable tariff strategy deepens fractures in both transatlantic and transpacific relationships, pushing nations to seek new arrangements that insulate them from American volatility. Prime Minister Carney's Davos remarks captured a pivotal moment. The architecture that held global cooperation together after the Cold War, long anchored by U.S. leadership, is coming apart, not through gradual transition, but through erratic geopolitics and the growing use of economic pressure as a weapon.
In this environment, Trump's tariff threats cannot be viewed as isolated policy decisions. They function as signals, often crude ones, that ripple across global markets and political capitals. Whether aimed at Canada, South Korea, or tied to aircraft certification fights, the pattern is the same. Washington is prioritizing economic leverage over alliance stability. But instead of coercing partners into line, this approach has produced something very different. Nations are realigning collectively, seeking arrangements that reduce their dependence on any one power. The EU-India deal, expanded cooperation in Asia, and deepening ties with China are all signs that the old order is losing its pull, and that countries are building new networks they believe will serve them better.
For decades, Canada's economy has been tied closely to the United States, but the recent wave of tariff threats and geopolitical friction has pushed Ottawa to accelerate a shift it had already begun. The preliminary tariff agreement with China is a clear example. It lowers barriers on key Canadian exports like canola and eases duties on Chinese electric vehicles, signaling a pragmatic reset after several difficult years in the bilateral relationship. Carney's government has emphasized repeatedly that this is not a full free trade deal, nor does it violate any commitments under USMCA. Ottawa has no intention of negotiating a comprehensive FTA with Beijing. Instead, it is pursuing targeted technical measures that stabilize markets and open specific channels where Canadian exporters stand to benefit. But even with that careful framing, the political message is unmistakable. Canada will act independently when its economic security requires it. What Carney is proposing isn't a break from the United States, it's a recalibration. His point is that cooperation shouldn't depend on coercion, and that middle powers like Canada, Japan, South Korea, and several European states share a common challenge. They are trying to maintain stability in a landscape where major powers use economic tools to force alignment. Carney's strategy is to build a web of overlapping relationships with Europe, with the Indo-Pacific, with India, and ASEAN, so that Canada can hedge against sudden shocks from any single partner. The logic resonates beyond Canada's borders. Many countries no longer want to be pulled into the gravitational tug-of-war between Washington and Beijing. They are looking for flexible, resilient networks that allow them to trade, invest, and cooperate without becoming dependent. What is emerging is not a rebellion against any one power, but a more distributed global system where middle powers have far more room to shape the rules.
The U.S. response to these shifts has been mostly defensive. Trump's rapid pivots between threats and walkbacks have injected uncertainty into relationships that once relied on steady American leadership. As confidence erodes, some European governments and traditional Pacific allies are moving ahead with trade and investment talks with China and others, often without U.S. participation. Trump's portrayal of Canadian trade diversification as an act of betrayal reflects a foreign policy rooted in zero-sum thinking. But many nations are rejecting that logic. They are looking for arrangements that expand their options without surrendering sovereignty, and Canada is increasingly part of that conversation. Canada's evolving approach does not signal an abandonment of the United States. The economic relationship remains deep, and no responsible government would walk away from such an integrated market. What Ottawa is doing instead is adjusting to a world where relying on one partner, even a close ally, carries real risks. In this environment, diversification is not a gesture of defiance, it's a form of protection. That shift is part of a broader global trend. Middle powers are stepping into roles that used to be overshadowed by superpowers. Agreements like the EU-India Pact, Canada's renewed openings with China, and expanding engagement with ASEAN show how countries are building their own networks, not waiting for Washington or Beijing to dictate the terms. Canada's diplomacy, steady, predictable, and grounded in long-term planning, stands in sharp contrast to the confrontational style coming from the United States. And this is where Trump's strategy may be backfiring. Every tariff threat, every public insult, every sudden policy reversal reinforces why countries like Canada are choosing to diversify. Rather than isolating Canada, Trump's tactics risk isolating the United States itself. Nations aren't banning America, but they are quietly reorganizing their alliances and supply chains so they no longer depend on U.S. stability. The takeaway is clear. Canada is positioning itself not as a replacement for the United States, but as a reliable player in a world that values consistency more than ever. And the more unpredictable American policy becomes, the more valuable that reliability will be. The central question is no longer whether Canada can withstand Trump-era turbulence. It already is. The real question is whether Ottawa's evolving trade strategy becomes a model for how middle powers navigate a fractured international system. Is the United States driving the world into competing blocs or unintentionally knitting new blocs closer together? And can Canada's diversification approach set the standard for countries seeking balance between sovereignty and integration? This will be one of the defining challenges for Canada in 2026, with implications that stretch far beyond the border.
I'll tell you what I would do. I'd never apologize to Donald Trump. Donald Trump's trying to destroy our province, destroy our country, steal manufacturing jobs and auto sector jobs, steel jobs, aluminum jobs. The list keeps going on. I'll never apologize to President Trump.
In a week already charged with tariff tension and political theater, Ontario Premier Doug Ford delivered a statement that cut straight through the noise. "I'll never apologize to Donald Trump," he told reporters. "They could put me on a stretching rack. I wouldn't do it." Those words landed like a thunderclap. Ford wasn't just rejecting Trump's demand for contrition over Ontario's controversial anti-tariff ad. He was drawing a line in the sand for all of Canada. His tone was defiant, his message unmistakable. Canada would not bow, not even under direct pressure from the White House.
The drama began with an unexpected media offensive. Ontario's government had purchased airtime across American networks for a provocative commercial that used archival audio of Ronald Reagan denouncing tariffs. The symbolism was obvious. Reagan, the conservative hero of free trade, seemingly calling out Trump's own protectionist crusade. The ad hit hard. Within days, it generated over 12 billion impressions worldwide, trended on U.S. cable talk shows, and was even quoted on the floor of the U.S. Senate. But at the same time, it infuriated President Trump, who viewed the campaign as a personal affront. In response, Trump, already fuming over Canada's resistance to his Liberation Day tariffs, suspended trade talks with Ottawa. Washington insiders called it one of the most severe diplomatic breakdowns of the Trump-Carney era. Back in Toronto, reporters pressed Ford for details. He confirmed that Trump himself had called repeatedly, demanding that the ad be pulled. Ford refused at first. He said, "We waited 3 days because it was working." Eventually, the ad was paused, but Ford emphasized that the campaign had already done its job, reminding Americans that tariffs on Canada were effectively taxes on American consumers. At the same time, Prime Minister Mark Carney, who had been traveling in Asia, quietly moved to calm the situation. According to Ottawa insiders, Carney's team offered an apology to Washington in hopes of restarting negotiations. Ford made clear that such diplomacy wasn't his style. He said bluntly, "I'll never apologize to President Trump. He's trying to destroy our province, our country, steal aluminum and auto jobs. You show weakness, he'll smell it like a pit bull."
Beneath the sound bites lies a complex political fault line, one that runs through the heart of Canada's trade strategy in the Trump era. Mark Carney's federal government is pursuing what officials call a strategic discipline approach. Rebuild trust with the U.S. administration, avoid public escalation, and prepare for the 2026 USMCA review that could reshape North American trade for a generation. The goal is long-term stability, not short-term confrontation. Doug Ford's approach could not be more different.
He speaks the language of political populism, blunt, emotional, and rooted in the frustrations of working-class Ontarians who see factories closing and supply chains collapsing. For Ford, Trump's tariffs are not abstract policy. They are a direct attack on people who build cars, pour steel, and keep Ontario's industrial heart beating. Tariffs don't work anywhere in the world, Ford insisted. They especially don't work with your number one customer. His argument resonated with business leaders across southern Ontario who have watched billions in investment shift south since the White House began reshoring production. The Premier's hard-nosed stance also carries political calculation. By publicly defying Trump, Ford positions himself as a protector of Canadian sovereignty, a rare moment when a provincial leader steps into the national arena and wins applause. Polls taken after the controversy showed a surge of support for Ford among manufacturing belt voters who feel abandoned by Ottawa's measured tone. Yet Ford's defiance also risked fracturing Canada's trade front. Carney's team, wary of mixed signals, reminded premiers that international negotiations fall under federal jurisdiction. It is the responsibility of the Government of Canada to conduct these talks, the Prime Minister emphasized, subtly rebuking Ford's independent foray. Over the following days, Ford softened, slightly. "He's the Prime Minister, I'm the Premier," he said later. "When it comes to national issues like making a deal with the U.S., that falls on his lap. I'm there to support him." The pivot reflected both pragmatism and political pressure. With trade talks on ice and markets nervous, unity was the only viable message. Even so, Ontario hasn't fully retreated. Ford continues to enforce his province's ban on U.S. alcohol sales in government-run stores, the lone retaliatory policy still in effect. He said, "Anything could be an irritant, but we have to stand firm." The measure is mostly symbolic, but it captures a wider truth. Canada's patience with Washington's tariff games is wearing thin.
The Ford-Carney split is emblematic of a broader transformation inside Canada. For decades, the country prided itself on quiet diplomacy, a steady, understated counterpart to America's louder politics. But under Trump's second term, that balance has changed. The U.S. now treats trade as a weapon, not a partnership. Tariffs on steel, autos, and lumber are bargaining chips. Canadian leaders must decide whether to respond with calm negotiation or visible pushback. Ford's refusal to apologize and his description of Trump as a pit bull who smells weakness captures the mood of a country tired of being the polite neighbor. Across Canada, editorial pages called it the first honest answer to Trump's bullying. Meanwhile, Ottawa faces a tightrope. Every escalation risks jeopardizing billions in cross-border trade, yet every concession risks political backlash at home. The federal government is trying to avoid another collapse of talks before the 2026 USMCA review, where Washington is expected to demand stricter rules of origin and new auto content quotas.
Doug Ford's vow never to apologize may have begun as a fiery soundbite, but it has evolved into something far larger, a symbol of Canadian resistance in a new era of economic confrontation. For decades, Canada's political culture valued restraint, careful phrasing, polite negotiation, and compromise. Now, in the face of relentless tariffs and shifting alliances, that old playbook is being rewritten. Ford's defiance, Carney's diplomacy, together they illustrate a country testing the boundaries of its independence. As the countdown to the 2026 USMCA review begins, the question for Canadians is no longer whether to push back, but how. Will Canada continue playing the patient partner, or will it adopt Ford's bolder tone, one that meets Trump's aggression head-on? Because in the end, the stakes go far beyond one commercial or one apology. They go to the heart of Canada's economic sovereignty. And as Ford put it, with unmistakable conviction,
If anything, you roll over with President Trump. We've seen what President Trump does. He smells weakness, he'll latch on you like a pit bull. And we should never, ever show weakness with President Trump. And we'll never stop fighting for Ontario and Canadian jobs.
This is our moment to define our next century. I am 100% confident that this budget is the right budget for this country at this moment. This is not a game.
The speed,
scope and scale of change that we're witnessing in Canada and around the world is quite unprecedented. That's why we need a strong response.
In Ottawa, the House of Commons fell silent. Cameras focused on Prime Minister Mark Carney as he rose to deliver his first national budget. There was no applause, no laughter, just quiet expectation. For weeks, headlines had questioned whether he could handle the pressure, whether his economic vision was too ambitious for a country caught between inflation worries and Donald Trump's tariffs. When he spoke, his voice was steady. This wasn't just a financial plan. It was the moment Canada decided what kind of nation it wanted to be in a world ruled by trade wars and uncertainty. This budget wasn't about political survival. It was about economic transformation. Carney called it a budget for the next century, and for many Canadians, it marked the start of something much bigger, a turning point in how Canada would stand on its own even as its largest trading partner turned protectionist. Before the budget day, the skepticism was intense. An Ipsos poll for Global News showed that 70% of Canadians believed the government should maintain a balanced budget. Another 42% wanted help with everyday expenses, while 32% prioritized lower income taxes. Only 1 in 4 cared about countering U.S. tariffs. Carney's opponents painted him as out of touch, accusing him of ignoring affordability and pushing Canada toward higher deficits. Yet he refused to back down. The former central banker, who once ran the Bank of England, seemed unfazed by political noise. He was focused on what he called generational investment, an idea that the country needed to build long-term strength rather than chase short-term relief. His message was unpopular but clear. Canada couldn't keep borrowing confidence from the United States. It had to earn it from within. When the numbers were released, even critics had to take a breath. The federal deficit would rise to around 75 billion Canadian dollars for the current fiscal year, according to projections cited by Reuters and the Financial Times. But the composition of that spending was what stunned observers. The budget poured tens of billions into infrastructure, railways, ports, highways, and airports, while boosting defense funding to historic levels. It also introduced targeted tax reforms to attract global investment. Companies could now write off capital assets more quickly, a move inspired by U.S. tax policy, but tailored to Canadian industries. At the same time, Carney ordered a major spending review, cutting or phasing out programs that had ballooned over the last decade. One example was the government's 2 billion trees program, which would stop halfway through. These savings would help fund what he called a pivot economy, one focused on innovation, logistics, and energy security. It was a mix of restraint and ambition, a blueprint that aimed to rebuild Canada's economic engine while keeping its fiscal credibility intact. The deeper message of the budget was not about numbers, but about strategy. Carney understood that Canada could not fight tariffs with more tariffs. Instead, he chose to fight with competitiveness. By investing in national infrastructure, modern manufacturing, and defense, Canada positioned itself as a reliable base for global supply chains that no longer trusted the volatility south of the border. The new tax structure made it easier for foreign investors to commit capital in Canada, just as American politics grew unpredictable. This approach quietly shifted Canada's role in the global trade war. Instead of reacting to Trump's pressure, Carney created the conditions to make Canada stronger without confrontation. The Financial Times called it a generational bet on national resilience. It was a different kind of power, not loud, not theatrical, but strategic. Carney also had to navigate politics. His government held a minority in Parliament, meaning one failed vote could trigger an election. Yet, through discipline and careful timing, he built a temporary bridge across party lines. NDP members, initially skeptical, found enough in the budget to avoid forcing a vote of no confidence. A few moderate conservatives even admitted the plan was more coherent than they expected. Instead of chasing applause, Carney used quiet authority. He convinced Parliament, not through slogans, but through logic, that a strong, self-sufficient Canada was in everyone's interest. Within days, media outlets described it as his first commanding political victory. For a leader only months into his tenure, it was a remarkable shift from defending his credibility to defining the national agenda. Beneath the politics lay a clear economic vision. The budget's theme, from reliance to resilience, was not just a slogan. It marked a structural pivot away from overdependence on U.S. markets. Funding was directed to projects that connected Canada more deeply with Asia and Europe. Investments in Pacific ports, digital trade infrastructure, and energy export routes were designed to support future partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and ASEAN nations. This was the economic counterpart to Carney's foreign policy message. Canada would remain a Western ally, but would no longer rely on American demand to secure growth. Economists described the shift as pragmatic rather than ideological. It recognized the reality of a changing global order where nations had to diversify or decline. For the first time in decades, Canada was not waiting for Washington to dictate its economic direction. It was charting its own course.
Of course, every transformation comes with costs. Some environmental initiatives were scaled back, the emission cap program was quietly shelved, and departments across government faced cuts of up to 15% in operational budgets over 3 years, as noted by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. But the trade-off was clear. In exchange, Canada would build new industrial capacity, strengthen national defense, and protect critical mineral supply chains, areas directly threatened by the global trade conflict. For many Canadians, this was a moment of uneasy pride. The cuts were difficult, but the purpose was unmistakable. The country was taking control of its economic destiny. The message behind the numbers was simple: real independence requires real sacrifice.
When the budget speech ended, there was no dramatic flourish. Carney simply closed his folder and sat down, as the chamber filled with murmurs. The opposition looked uncertain. Even his critics seemed to recognize that something had changed. Canada, for the first time in years, was not reacting to the world, it was leading with purpose. The budget silenced doubts not because it pleased everyone, but because it proved that leadership still matters. Carney had taken a divided, uncertain country and given it a clear direction: invest, adapt, and believe in itself. In an age when trade wars dominate headlines and leaders shout across borders, Canada's Prime Minister had chosen a different weapon: competence. As one analyst put it after the budget release, Trump rewrote the rules of global trade with confrontation. Carney answered with strategy. For Canada, that difference may define the next century.